In this segment, we're going to look at the movements and muscles of the pectoral girdle.
The pectoral girdle moves relative to the axial skeleton at the sternoclavicular joint. A smaller degree of movement at the acromioclavicular joint allows for a bit of extra mobility in the girdle. However, we're primarily interested in the movement occurring at the sternoclavicular joint. And it's movement at that sternoclavicular joint that is realised at the scapulothoracic joint. And these movements are called elevation and depression, upward and downward rotation, and protraction and retraction.
Here we have a diagram that shows us the different movements at the scapulothoracic joint. Here we can see that the scapula is moving superiorly and inferiorly. These movements are elevation and depression. Here we can see the scapula is moving laterally and medially. These movements are known as protraction, where the scapula moves laterally around the thoracic cage, and retraction, where the scapula moves in towards the midline or in towards the vertebral column. And down here, these two movements involve a rotation of the scapula around an AP axis. So here we have upward rotation, where the inferior angle of the scapula moves laterally, but more importantly, the glenoid fossa actually tips upwards. And it's paired with downward rotation, where the inferior angle of the scapula moves medially, but importantly, the glenoid fossa now tips to point downwards. We're now going to watch a real person perform these movements of the scapulothoracic joint, and I'd like you to perform each of the movements using your own pectoral girdle whilst watching the model demonstrate them in the video. Firstly, we'll have elevation and depression. Next, protraction and retraction. And thirdly, upward rotation and downward rotation. Looking at the rotations again, there's upward rotation and downward rotation. The important implication of having this mobility in the girdle is that we can manipulate the position of the glenoid fossa, thereby enhancing the movement available at the glenohumeral joint. For example, during glenohumeral joint abduction, the scapulothoracic joint is upwardly rotating. We can start to also think about the muscles that are causing these movements and where they would most likely be located relative to the scapula. For example, a muscle that was going to cause elevation of the scapula would need to be located superiorly. Conversely, a muscle that was going to depress the scapula would need to be located inferiorly. I'd like you to pause the video now and have a go at applying this idea to these three muscles. Levator scapula, which is located here, rhomboid major, which is located here, and trapezius, which is located here. The muscles that act on the shoulder and pectoral girdle can be grouped into three groups: axioscapular, scapulohumeral, and axiohumeral, based on their origins and insertions, and therefore the joints that they cross and will act on. So for example, our axioscapular muscles will be those that have their origin on the trunk and their insertion somewhere on the girdle. Because of this, it means that the joints that those muscles will cross will be the scapulothoracic joint. This implies that they're acting at the sternoclavicular and acromioclavicular joints. Can you have a look at the diagram and identify a muscle that you think might be an axioscapular muscle? The scapulohumeral muscles are muscles that have their origin on the girdle and their insertion on the upper limb. Therefore, the joint that these muscles will cross will be the glenohumeral joint. Once again, can you see any muscles on this diagram that may fit that criteria? And the final group of muscles are known as the axiohumeral muscles. I'd like you to think and note down what their origin may be, what their insertion may be, and therefore what joints these muscles would likely cross. And once again, from this diagram, see if you can identify a muscle that fits this criteria. I'd now like you to analyse this reaching action. What movement is occurring at the glenohumeral joint of this person? And then name one muscle that can cause this movement. Also, what movement is occurring at the scapulothoracic joint? And name one muscle that can cause this movement.